the book, Treasure Island, Chapter 5, The Man on the Island. At first, Treasure Island seemed a fascinating place. There was marshes full of willows and odd, outlandish, swampy plants and trees. Here and there, I saw snakes. That hissed at me with a noise unlike that of a spinning top. I explored for a little while, and then I wandered into a thicket of live oak trees which grew along the sand. Suddenly, a wild duck flew up into the air, followed by another, and soon over the whole surface of the marsh, a great cloud of birds hung screaming and circling in the sky just above us. I guessed that some of my shipmates must be drawing near. I listened and heard voices, faint but growing louder. I got down on all fours and I crawled until I could see down into the little green dell beside the marsh, closely set about with trees. There, Long John Silver and a seaman named Tom stood face to face in conversation. It was clear that Silver was testing Tom, trying to find out if Tom would join the mutiny. "I'll not be led away," said Tom. "I'd sooner lose my hand if I forget my duty." All of a sudden, he was interrupted. Far away, out in the marsh, there arose an angry roar, and then another. Tom jumped at the sound, like a horse pricked by the rider's spurs. But Silver winked not an eye. He stood resting lightly on his crutch, watching his companion like a snake ready to pounce. "John," said Tom, "what was that?" "That?" said Silver, with a treacherous smile. "Oh, I reckon that was Alan." Then Tom seemed to understand everything at once. "Alan," he cried, fearing feeling the worst for his friend. Well, John Silver, you're no mate of mine, and that's a fact. I'll have no part in your mutiny. With that, the brave fellow turned his back on the cook, and he set off toward the beach. But he was not destined to go far. With a cry, Silver seized the branch of a tree, whipped the crutch from under his armpit, and sent the missile hurtling through the air. It struck poor Tom right between the shoulders in the middle of his back. His hands flew up. He let out a gasp. Oh. And then he fell. I was feeling faint. The whole world appeared to swim before me in a whirling mist. When I gathered my courage to look again, I saw Silver standing next to Tom. Who was motionless on the ground. A moment later, Silver pulled out a whistle and blew upon it, and I guessed he was calling the other pirates. And I was worried other pirates might find me. I crawled out of the underbrush and ran as fast as I could. It was all over for me, I was thinking. I would be captured by the mutineers. I ran without knowing where I was going until a new alarm brought me to a standstill. With a thumping heart, I saw a dark, shaggy figure leap up behind a tree trunk. Was it a bear? Or monkey? I could not tell, but I was afraid because I was now cut off on both sides. Behind me were the ferocious pirates, and in front of me, the lurking creature. The figure went from trunk to trunk, kind of like a deer. But it ran on two legs like a man. I was tempted to cry for help when another reassured me that the creature was indeed a man. I took some comfort in this discovery, and in the fact I had just remembered I carried a pistol in my pocket. I put one hand on my pistol, and I took a few steps forward. At that precise moment, the man leaped out in the open and threw himself on his knees and held out his hands as if begging for mercy. I could see that he was an Englishman like myself, but his clothes, his clothes were old and tattered, and his skin had been burned by the sun. In fact, his eyes were bright, quite startling, on his face that was so burned. "Who are you?" I demanded. "I is Ben Gunn. I am," he replied. His voice sounded like a rusty lock. "I haven't spoken with a man for 3 years. I am surprised I know how to speak." 3 years, I cried. "Were you shipwrecked here?" "Nay, friend," said he, "I was marooned." I had heard the word, and I knew it stood for a horrible kind of punishment common among buccaneers. It was my understanding that when a person is marooned, he is abandoned on a desolate island with not much to depend on other than his wits. "I was marooned 3 years ago," continued the man. "I have lived on goats, berries, and oysters, but my heart longs for English food. At nighttime, I dream of cheese." All this time, he had been looking at me and smiling. He seemed to take a childish pleasure in the presence of a fellow creature. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jim Hawkins," I told him. "Well now, Jim," he said, "if I ever go back to England, I am changing my ways and the company that I have. I am a changed man." "And Jim," he continued, looking around and lowering his voice to a little bit more than a whisper, I am rich. You're gonna thank your lucky stars, you will, that you was the first that found me. Then a shadow passed over his face, and he took hold of my hand, and he raised one threatening finger before my eyes. Now, Jim, he said, tell me the truth. Is that Flint's ship that you came here on? No, I replied. It's not Flint's ship. Flint is dead. But we have some of his crew with us. Not a man with one leg, he gasped. John Silver, I asked. Yes, that's his name, he said anxiously. After talking with Ben Gunn for a few minutes, I was no longer feared him. In fact, I told him the story of our voyage, and he heard it with the keenest of interest. Well, he said, you and your friends are in a pinch, aren't you? Well, never you mind. Just put your trust in Ben Gunn. But tell me one thing. Is this squire of yours an honest man? Yes, I said. Suppose I gave him a share of my money. Do you think he would let me sail home with you? He asked. Oh, I'm sure that he would do that, I replied. He seemed greatly relieved to hear this. Well then, he went on, I will tell you my story. I was on Flint's ship when he buried the treasure. He went ashore on this very island with 6 strong men. They were ashore nearly a week and left the rest of us on the ship. Eventually, Flint came back all by himself. There he was. The 6 men, they were all dead. How he had done it, not a man aboard could make out. Billy Bones, he was the mate back then, and Silver was also a part of the crew. Then, 3 years back, I was on another ship, and we sighted the island. Boys, said I, this is where Flint buried the treasure. Let's go ashore and find it. "12 days we spent looking for it. Then the others gave up and went back aboard. Aboard. But as for you, Benjamin Gunn, says they, here's a musket and a spade and a pickaxe. You can stay here and find Flint's money for yourself. Well, Jim, that's my story. Now be a good lad and run and speak to the squire. Tell him I know this island like it's my own. How am I going to get back to the ship? I asked. You can use my boat, he said. I made it with my own 2 hands. I keep it under a white rock. Along the shore. Then, quite suddenly, we heard the boom, wow, of cannon. Cannon. They have begun to fight, I cried. We stayed together in the undergrowth, unaware of time passing, listening to the sound of the cannon and the pistol fire. Eventually, I decided I should make my way toward the anchorage. Ben agreed to accompany me. At some point along the way, we saw Union Jack flag fluttering above the trees. Hey, that must be your friends, said Ben. It can't be, I said, stunned by the sight of the flag. On the ship. That must be Silver or some of the other mutineers. Not likely, said Ben Gunn. In a place like this, where no one puts in but gentlemen of fortune, Silver would fly the Jolly Roger. You see, Jim, just over that hill is an old stockade. Captain Flint built it many years ago, and I reckon your friends have retreated to the stockade, and Silver has the ship. Well, I said, if it's really them, I should try to help. I'm not going to go with you, said Ben Gunn. Not until I have the opportunity to meet with the squire in private. If he wants to talk, tell him where he can find me and to come with a white flag. White flag. To show he means well. At that moment, a cannonball came whizzing through the trees. And tore up the sand, not 100 yards from us. I ran one way, and Ben Gunn ran the other way. After parting with Ben Gunn, I decided to assess the situation. First, I went to check on the Hispaniola. I saw she was still anchored in the same place, but now she was flying the Jolly Roger. It seemed like the pirates had indeed taken over the ship. Next, I scouted the shoreline and I saw a big white rock. And I figured it must be the rock beneath which Ben Gunn had hid his boat. Then I made my way through the woods until I came to the stockade. It was a plain log house surrounded by a tall fence. I saw that Ben Gunn had been right. My friends were in the stockade with the Union Jack. Flying above them. I called out to them and was warmly welcomed. They told me their story, and I told them mine. When fighting broke out on the ship, they had decided they would be safer on the island. So they escaped in two of the boats with some guns and supplies. They heard about the stockade. When the pirates saw them rowing away, they fired on them from the ship and then attacked the stockade. Old Redruth had been killed, and another of our loyal men, Gray, had been injured. After telling my story, I had a chance to look about me. The stockade was made of trunks of pine. Near the door of the stockade was a little spring that welled up and provided fresh water. There's a small chimney in the roof through which only a little bit of smoke found its way out. The rest of the smoke stayed in the house, and it kept us coughing. If we had been allowed to sit idle, we would have all fallen into the blues. But Captain Smollett, he divided us into 2 watches. The doctor questioned me about Ben Gunn. Do you think he's sane, Jim? I'm not quite sure. He seems a little strange. Well, said the doctor, you can't expect a man who has spent 3 years on a deserted island to be as smart, as clear-minded as you or me. We had very little in the way of food, and the captain was worried. He thought our best hope was to get the better of the Buccaneers. They had lost 4 men, and 2 others were wounded.